Good morning, everyone. My name is Grant Parker. I'm an associate professor of African and African American studies and also of classics here at Stanford University. And as a faculty affiliate of Stanford's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, CESTA, I'm especially delighted to be part of the proceedings. Thank you very much, organizers, for inviting me. This is a chance for us to come together from very different sectors. I myself have been interested in the curation of Southern African archives and materials, working together with the heritage sector in Southern Africa. And I must say, I constantly surprise myself by approaching curators with a sense of open access is the way to go. I come with this assumption and repeatedly find that curators feel very differently. And so this is a chance to think about some questions such as indigenous languages, which are disappearing so fast throughout the world, of records, of underrepresented communities, when, as the cliche goes, history is typically written by the victors, and about the access to public knowledge and the quality of its presentation. This panel stems most directly from a challenge. If we can agree that the commercial development of technology has been driven by a profit motive, the question arises, can we create a research agenda and gain support to make a push for knowledge rather than profit as an organizing principle? Discuss. This is the deceptively simple, but in fact, taxing brief that we have received from our organizers. To address this topic, we are delighted to welcome the following panelists: Professor Claudio Pinhanez, Principal Research Scientist of IBM Brazil, and also Deputy Director of the Center for AI with the University of Sao Paulo. Professor Audra Diptee, Associate Professor of History at Carleton University, who researches colonialism and imperialism in the Caribbean and in Africa, and has created waves, if you will pardon the pun, in the public histories thereof. Third, Abigail Potter, Senior Innovation Specialist at the Library of Congress. Abigail has become a seasoned expert in designing and implementing large-scale digital programs and services in complex organizations. Then Dr. Leila Zia, Head of Research at Wikimedia Foundation, where she has held senior positions for over 10 years following a Stanford PhD in Management Science and Technology. And then Jefferson Bailey, Director of Archiving and Data Services of the Internet Archive based here in San Francisco. Jefferson has been here for something like a decade after starting his career in the Northeast, I believe.
Sounds like AI wrote that.
Something like that. You'll notice we have a mix of representatives of the tech sector per se, as well as specialized user innovators. We especially welcome a meeting of perspectives and experiences on both the design and the applied sides. Each panelist will start by describing their own organization or research and will offer an initial response to the opening challenge mentioned. Each panelist will have 5 minutes, so everyone gets a chance to build the scaffolding for a conversation, first among the panelists, and then with you, our invited audiences. So our 90 minutes approximately will be, the first third will be the panelists' presentations, the second third will be the interaction of our panelists, and the last third will be your discussion with the panelists. And I will ask the panelists at the end each to help us wrap up. So that's the plan. From each panelist, we would like to know the following. How does your work engage with AI in relation to the following elements? You might choose from these. You might not want to dwell on each of them. We're interested in preservation, we're interested in curation, we're interested in access, and we're interested in data sovereignty. So this is a very large agenda for relatively little time. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Claudio Pinhanez.
Again, thank you for the introduction. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Monica Lam and team, to invite me. It's a pleasure to be here. Maybe a little different than other people in this panel. I'm a computer science by training and by work. I've been working with AI for almost 40 years, starting with Feigenbaum and Nielsen and Minsky, I mean, that stuff in the 80s. And the last 5 years of my career, I got interested in doing work related to preserving knowledge and culture of that very small groups of people know and use and have access. So what I'm going to be talking here is how we preserve knowledge of niches of people. And especially I'm interested in niches of people who work in different that live in different environments, that have different cultures, very different cultures from ours, like indigenous people. So about 3 years ago, we started a project where we have been looking into how to use technology, and especially AI, to help avoid the disappearance of indigenous languages. In Brazil, we have about 200 indigenous languages. All but 2 are likely to be gone by the end of the century. And as we started this, when we started to engage with these communities, we have understood that this problem is more complicated than we thought, as we expected in some ways. But a key component that's happening right now is for communities that where the language is alive and is spoken and is thriving, they have just found a new enemy. And this new enemy is the internet. Many of these communities, internet is arriving now or 1 year ago. Especially in the Amazon area, it's arriving through satellite communications like Starlink. And first thing, they want it. They understand the value of that. But one thing they have seen, and this we spoke to many different groups of people, is that their language is not used in the internet. In most cases, it's using every day. They talk each other. They write and read in many situations in their own language, but in paper, not in the digital world. And for them, for their leaderships, for their teachers, it's clear that if the language doesn't move to the digital world, it's going to disappear. It's essential that for the preservation that they move to the digital world. So what we are trying to help them is to develop tools that help their people, especially their young people, to write and read in the internet. Because when we use our languages in the internet, we have a lot of support. We have translation tools, we have orthographic correctors, we have word completers, we have search that works. And that's not true for those indigenous languages. Search does not work. Even the keyboard is a problem. So we are partnering now with especially 2 communities this year, middle of the Amazon area, 2 Baré communities. And we are going to bring some tools, some prototypes to their classrooms to see, first, do those tools help them to write more and better? That's one thing that the teachers are very concerned. Second, will those tools make them write in their language in social media, in other sites? And third, will the students and the teachers will produce more content, digital content, by using these tools? Because if you want them to preserve the language in the 21st century, and that's our interest more than anything. But if we want this language, this knowledge to be preserved, they have to make this move. And for this move, we need tools. Okay, and that's what we are doing. We are establishing this partnership. We're also working with a very large organization, one of the largest indigenous organizations in Brazil, that's helping us in this process. And the idea is, if this succeeds, this organization that can help us to scale this through other communities, other schools, and so on. This is an organization that covers an area that's a third of the state of California, 700 communities, 23 ethnicities, and they know how to scale. They have just deployed 1,000 points of Starlink in 6 months. And they, of course, we don't know how to fund this. I mean, first year is funded by IBM. How to fund to 700 communities, we will need support. But this is, I think, essential. When we think about preserving, we have to make sure that the language is alive, it's used in the digital world, and then we can talk about other issues, like how we can bring this to outside or not, and especially, and this I will leave to the question part, is issues of data sovereignty, data governance, and so on, okay? But basically, I think what I've learned in this project is there's so much knowledge, so much special and important knowledge that has to be preserved, but this involves also the process of bringing them to the world we are in, which right now they're still not there. They have to occupy this white man's land, which is the internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Diptee.
Hello. Again, thank you for the invitation, Trev, Monica, and other people involved in the organization of the event. I am a historian by training, so my tech expertise is limited, to put it kindly. But I will talk a little bit about my project, my current research project, and I don't have answers to any of these questions, but I will pose questions that perhaps complicate the questions that we've been asked to reflect on. So about my project looks at British colonial documents that became available to the world in around 2011 because of a court case concerning colonial human rights abuses committed in Kenya in the 1950s. Up until about 2011, these documents were hidden and their existence was denied under the British policy called Operation Legacy. So in a nutshell, the goal of this policy, which was implemented between the 1950s and the 1970s, was either to destroy colonial documents or to secretly remove them just before each of its colonies was on the verge of gaining political independence. So they did not want the incoming politically independent governments to see what they had been up to, right? So they left some documents and then removed others that they thought, and literally they said, we want to remove documents that will, quote unquote, that will embarrass the British government. We do not want them to see those documents. So that was one of the criteria. So while we will never have a complete picture of how many documents were destroyed, we do know that there are about 20,000 colonial documents that are now available to researchers. Despite their availability of these documents, there are challenges with accessing them. Most of them remain undigitized. They are all held in the National Archives in England, so the National Archives of the United Kingdom. They are not, to state the obvious, that means that they are not easily accessible to scholars in the Global South, which makes it, because they're in England, it makes it difficult and expensive for these scholars to get to that archive. And then even if you are based and you do have the money and you can get there, there are other sorts of challenges. You have to order the documents 1 week in advance. There's a daily limit of 14 files per day. Each file has several hundred documents. So it again slows down the process of reviewing the documents, and it creates another level hindrances for scholars from the global south who need to visit to see these documents. And as a result, since 2011 to now, with the exception of a few parts of a few former British colonies, they're relatively underused. So Kenya, of course, is one of the obvious ones, but in other parts of other former British colonies, they continue to be underused, generally speaking. So we know that there are 20,000 files for 37 former colonies that are directly linked. These files are directly linked to Operation Legacy. And so for the first phase of my project, I'm working on a subset of these files that focuses specifically on the Caribbean in an attempt to develop an appropriate system that improves accessibility and democratizes their use. The goal then is to not only explore the ways in which emerging AI technology can be used, but to reflect on the kinds of best practices and methodologies that need to be developed. And as a really important disclaimer, I am not an expert in archival methods and record keeping. So I have had to rely heavily on the expertise of my colleagues in the Caribbean who actually work in this area and have spent decades of their lives doing this kind of work. So two issues that have come up based on conversations with them as I work to collaborate with them are the following. One, they're interested in asking in what ways can we use AI technology to create narratives that reflect global South perspectives? Are there methodologies that we could implement that assure us that global South perspectives are going to be included and so develop those kinds of narratives? And after some conversations with these colleagues who specialize in archive management, et cetera, they want to know that they are concerned about whether or not AI can truly be adapted to reflect global South epistemologies, perspectives, research questions. And they want some assurances that AI technology reflects the memory and record-keeping practices that emerge out of Caribbean experiences. So they argue that the methodologies around record keeping that come out of the global South or the Caribbean in this particular case, because I've been talking to people from the Caribbean, are particular and unique and different from what happens in the global North. So that's the first issue. And the second issue is a bit obvious, but it has to do with the digital divide, which of course is not nearly where it used to be. Thanks to cell phones and that kind of thing. But it's not completely eradicated. And this means that even if methodologies were developed to include global South perspectives, there will be some built-in systematic imbalances that privilege the ways of knowing that come out of the global North. And this is directly linked to access to resources, expertise, and training. And I'll just end there.
Sure, thanks. I echo the thanks. It's fantastic to be in this room, to be together to talk about these topics, which are very interesting, and I hope we can make progress together. So I'm at the Library of Congress, and first I'll just sort of talk a little bit about the history of the Library of Congress and sort of the transformation over time, and then bring us here and what we're doing with AI now. So the Library of Congress is part of the federal government. It's the oldest cultural heritage organization in the federal government. So it predates NARA and Smithsonian. So when it began, it was housed in the Capitol of the United States in Washington, and it basically had a lot of documents about the United States. So the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution was originally at the Library of Congress. There was a war where when the Capitol of the United States was burned down by British and Canadian troops, and all of somebody had the foreknowledge to take the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and roll it up and take it over to Virginia. So that did not burn, but everything else burned. And after that, the Capitol and the Library of Congress, as you know it now, was rebuilt. And it was rebuilt also from Thomas Jefferson's personal collection. And it was at that time that it kind of shifted from being an institution that collected about the machinations of the United States to a universal collection. So it collects in every topic that Congress would have to learn about to make laws in the United States. That's sort of the universal collection, collecting in all languages. Often the biggest concentration of a language is at the Library of Congress outside of the country. So it's a gigantic, big collection. It keeps growing. We keep getting 30,000 volumes at our desk. I mean, at our loading dock every month. And it's a largely analog organization still. Book trucks are moving along. It's a kind of old school library. And it also contains the Congressional Research Service. Congressional Research Service is sort of a think tank advisor service that serves directly to Congress. They answer questions from congressional staff. They produce reports. They also have the congress.gov resource, which is all of the legislative information that comes out of each Congress every year. We also have the Copyright Office as part of the Library of Congress. So this is a big way our collection grows also. When people register for copyright, they send 2 copies of the books in, and we from there keep some for the national collection, and then we give away the rest. But it is, and it has a long history, and it's been it has tried to embrace new technologies along the way. So MARC records. So this is the first digital machine readable kind of format for catalog records. Catalog records are, I'm sure you used the catalog card when you were younger and at the library. That's all online now. But that was a huge transformation that happened. And after, digitization, putting collections online, digitizing them, a huge transformation of workflows, and then digital preservation also. So, collecting new types of material, trying to understand how to provide access to it, and preserve it for the life of the Republic, which is what our goal is. So with I work in a department called LC Labs, and it's in our sort of IT department, and we do experiments with new technologies, and we're trying to understand what the library could use and what would be of benefit. So AI has been a lot of what we've been examining lately. We also have an Innovator in Residence program, which does sort of public-facing experiments with our digital collections. But the goal there is to create more value from these collections. So we've put a lot of time and effort, a lot of work into creating collections, digitizing them, describing them, making them available. And the sort of ground moves a lot, but that's what our sort of overarching goal is to do. In our AI sort of experiments, we've been starting with some very kind of in the high risk category. So we've been experimenting with creating catalog records with AI. So can we use tools to suggest, the title, author, bibliographic information. We have a lot of catalogers at the Library of Congress. Our catalogers sort of set the standard of how cataloging is done across the country. These catalog records are also the sort of backbone to our access system. They're very important to libraries, and we have a lot of staff time devoted to them. Although our staff gets smaller and smaller and smaller every year, the amount of content that we have to collect gets larger and larger and larger. So this is a big challenge for us, and we would love AI to help. We're also looking at on the Congress.gov side, can we use AI to summarize bills? Can these bills are, I'm sure more and more bills are being proposed to Congress. Very few pass, but they're longer and more complex. So our CRS staff, legislative analysts, or experts in the law, they create these summaries that summarizes what would change in the law if these bills were passed. So this is a very sort of important authoritative record. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It's so this is sort of a high value, but there's also a lot of desire for these summaries to be done as quickly as possible to move along the legislative process. and then we've also done experiments with extracting metadata from historic copyright registration forms. So we have these forms that were handwritten, that were typed, that were digitized, and traditional sort of OCR technologies don't really work well on them. So we went through a process of, with our copyright staff, annotating those pages, creating labeled data, and then training a model to extract key information about dates and time of publication and things that people that are trying to research the copyright status of content would need. So and we have others, but these are we're testing, and the error rate is concerning for some, especially for the content that's authoritative, the content that doesn't exist in any other format. So this is so we're trying to develop an evaluation sort of practice of how to know what's good enough, know what's not good enough. We evaluate on is it responsible? So does it support our underlying goals for serving the public good? Does it increase trust with our users? Those kinds of things. Is it effective? Is it good enough? This is where a lot of our tests have fallen down, because it isn't quite good enough just to work automatically. So a human in the loop approach is what we're taking, or what we're pursuing mostly. And then, is it practical? So can we integrate it into our kind of legacy information technology systems we have? Can we afford it? Can we afford it forever? How can we maintain it to be stable? So these are big questions that we have to consider when we're thinking of adopting it for, how the Library of Congress is going to adopt AI in our operations, and how we're going to do it strategically. I'll leave it there. Pass on.
Thank you very much. Dr. Zia?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me and having me here. I'll just say at the start that what I'll share with you is, after a decade of doing research on the Wikimedia projects and being a researcher in that space, what I'll say is not necessarily the views of Wikimedia Foundation, definitely not necessarily the views of Wikimedia volunteer communities. I also want to just take a moment to thank all of you who have edited Wikipedia and the Wikimedia projects over the past 24 years. If you have donated to the projects, I see a couple of donors at least that I know in the room. Thank you for that. And if you have done research that helped advance our thinking of the Wikimedia projects and Wikipedia, thank you for that work, whether you're in the room or watching online or helping us behind the scenes to make this event happen. I'll start by talking a little bit about within Wikimedia Foundation, some of the work that we're doing in the space of AI and our thinking. I have co-led an effort in the foundation to develop an AI strategy for our editors. And what I want to highlight from that AI strategy are a few themes. One is that, as we reflected over the past 24 years of Wikipedia, what we see very clearly is that a project like Wikipedia is strong because of its communities of volunteers. So for us, as we thought about AI and what do we want to do with AI in support of the project, it was very clear that we need to focus on these editors, humans, researchers, developers who are focusing on the Wikimedia projects, and they're trying to improve these projects, and think about where can we use AI to improve their workflows and the work that they are already there to achieve. The other thing that was very clear is that the resources that we have are very limited. We cannot do AI for everything. It just does not make sense. So the approach that we took is, going back to some of Monica's points from her presentation earlier, we decided to take a very focused approach to look at what are the areas that actually the generative AI, the latest technologies that are coming in, can support editors, and what are these areas that editors cannot scale on their own, that they are actually having difficulties. And I will say that is one of the reasons that we awarded Wikimedia Foundation Research Award of the Year to Monica and her team. That is because we see that they're taking a very intentional approach as looking at AI and the set of technologies associated with that as a set of technologies with which we can do some things, but we need to figure out what are those things, and we need to figure out what are the limitations of those things. And if we can figure that out, then we will do better than we're going to be better off than we were before. On the topic of editors, we are particularly interested in supporting moderators and patrollers of Wikipedia. As you saw in earlier presentations, Wikipedia is a fundamental piece of encyclopedic knowledge for the web and internet. The pace of content generation has increased because generative AI is more readily accessible. However, the cost of verifiability has remained high, and it is important for us to support patrollers and moderators of the projects to be able to scope and scale, and we think AI has good promises in that space. We also think that the project, the technology has good promises for including more languages and more communities that we could not include before. However, we need to take a really nuanced approach to our thinking around languages and inclusion and what it means to develop these technologies. What are the kind of fundamental tasks that we think are important, tasks, let's say, powered by AI, that are important and core to the work of an encyclopedia that should be available in every Wikipedia language? And what are some of the things that are maybe nice to have, that it's good to leave the door open for them to be developed for all languages, but maybe we can live without them for some time, or the editors can live without them for some time. The last topic that I will say on this front is an application which is related to mentorship. So what we see is that generally projects like Wikipedia, like Wikidata, they want to bring new editors to the projects, new developers, new researchers. What current editors have a lot of challenge with is scaling mentorship, being able to welcome newcomers and include them as part of the editorship of the projects. And we think AI, and particularly large language models, have a lot of potential in that space. Going to the question that was posed at the start, similar to others, I don't have an answer, but I can share with you as I'm thinking about this topic of how can we think about, and is it possible to have a research agenda around, which is centered around AI, access, and knowledge. There are a couple of themes that are very present for me. Being here at Stanford in a research institution, academic institution, in the presence of many of you who are from Stanford or other academic institutions, I think it is important for us as researchers in academia to think about, rethink incentive mechanisms in academia. We have many new faculty and researchers who are joining who want to do research in this space. But if our focus of research and our research agenda is on knowledge, knowledge is a social construct, and research in this space is going to be slow. The incentive mechanisms around publish or peril need to change. We need to slow things down a little bit and incentivize our faculty, our researchers in a different way than we do today. That is one thing that I think a lot of universities have control over. Of course, it needs to be coordinated. It can't be that one university goes alone. But I want to ask you all who are in universities to think about that. The other aspect that is important to call out is the aspect of open access and free licenses. This has been mentioned multiple times throughout the morning, and I'll just call it out again. Our ability to be able to offer the services that we're talking about relies on institutions, projects, research to remain in the open, and open is not equivalent to just publishing it on our websites in a way that is readable. It needs to be freely licensed under licenses that machines can operate on, and we don't need to get permissions one per paper. So that's something which is, I think, to a lot of extents in the hands of universities, and I encourage you all in that space to think about that. And maybe the last point I'll raise, and then I'm happy to expand as we have more discussions and we hear your questions, is the investment in the open. Of course, we're here to talk about the investment in potential investments in the access to knowledge and via AI. And as you saw again throughout the morning, there are a lot of projects in the open today that rely on investments, whether the investments are financial investments, whether the investments are your time for doing editing and doing research. Let us continue to do that investment on the open for all these projects to prosper and for all the research to be able to bring these projects more to the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Jefferson?
Okay, thanks everyone. And like others, thank you to Monica and Trevor and everyone who invited us here, putting on this great event. So I am from the Internet Archive. I'll talk a little bit about what Internet Archive is if folks don't know, and then talk about what we do and how we're trying to use AI across a couple of different vectors. So Internet Archive was started in 1996 in San Francisco, originally started to be as the first organization to preserve the web as a historical document or resource. So that's how it got its name, and that's how it started. Since then, the remit has greatly expanded to archive basically anything and either make it digital if it's not already digital, and make it publicly accessible through archive.org and its various services and programs. So that includes digitizing millions of books a year. We have tens of millions of books. There's a huge archive of television, of software, of research data sets, of moving image, and all sorts of things. So a variety of different formats, a variety of different sources, and a variety of different curation methods. So one thing that Internet Archive also does is build open source software, tools, products, services for other libraries and individuals to use to do their own archiving or to contribute things to the Internet Archive. So what has the scale become in our 28 years or so? I think maybe these are not all official numbers, so don't quote me on them necessarily or expunge it from the video, but approaching over 200 petabytes of unique data, multiple copies of that for preservation purposes. The web archive itself, I think, is approaching, if not over 1 trillion web pages, going all the way back to the beginning of the organization in 1996, and growing exponentially every year given the growth of the web itself, as well as the increasing need to preserve some portions of it, including the last couple of weeks. So the Wayback Machine, which is the access to that collection, is the best known service for that. We also work with thousands of libraries, archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations around the world to provide them services, tools, infrastructures for them to use for their own archiving purposes. And a copy of that material also stays with Internet Archive. So it's a distributed curation model. We, of course, are ourselves a digital library and archive, so much of the archiving, collecting, preservation access, we are doing it, but we're doing it in conjunction as well with many thousands of other libraries and archives, including, of course, LC and others, especially in the US and North America. But also users individually contribute this. You can go to the Wayback Machine and have it and put in a web page and say archive it right now, and it will do that, and that's added to the permanent collection. So when we're talking, curation, preservation, access, the curation piece, I think, is an interesting model, at least from the Internet Archive perspective, in that it is multivalent, or whatever word you want to use to say that it is not just us deciding what is collected. It's not necessarily just others. It's not individuals. It's not just institutions. It's not just research libraries. It's also tiny public libraries. It's also community archives and things like that. So I think the curation is an important element to mention about how the Internet Archive aggregate collection was built and used. So focusing mostly on the web archive, because that's sort of the biggest one and also what it's most known for. Across all the Internet Archive things, we get about 3 million users a day, so it's heavily leveraged. We get a lot of press, both good and bad sometimes. Heavily utilized by both researchers, scholars, students, but also just the general public. So that's, I think, another unique aspect of the collection. As well, we own and operate and run all our own data centers. So we're a nonprofit, a 501c3, and owning the whole stack, as you might say, the infrastructure, the building, the servers, the data, the hardware, all that things is another important aspect of the organization. I think that feeds into the conversation that we'll be having around open access, open data, open ethos, and its application not just to the content itself, but also to the underlying tools, software, and even infrastructure and organizations. So that's sort of Internet Archive at a big nutshell. There's also, a number of programs that we operate to focus specifically on endangered data, not just like endangered by Trump, but also endangered through neglect, through unintentional, benign neglect is the library term, which just means somebody didn't think it was important, and maybe it's going to disappear quickly, and that could be physical, or it could be something on the web. Endangered could also be things that have lost their creator. The term is orphan works. And those can also be digital or physical, which means they're very unlikely to be preserved because someone cannot find or determine who was the creator of this work, and therefore they're disinclined to archive it or provide access to it since they can't give attribution or they don't have copyright privileges or whatnot. So I think there's many different types of endangered data that are both social, technical, situational, economic, and things like that. So I think we try to make efforts to do programs and services and tools to also focus on that. And then also try to build national networks to focus on preserving some of that endangered data or local data, or especially underrepresented data, which originally, at least in the sort of promise of the early web, was that it was very pluralistic. Anybody could make a website, anybody could put something online, and all of a sudden, if you're archiving it, the archival record could be much broader in context. Traditional paper archives are mostly, as we said at the beginning, history is written by the victors. Traditional print archives are mostly like the rich and famous, right? It's senators, politicians, wealthy people, whatnot. So the early promise of the web, which, is that an early promise still around? Kind of, I don't know, social media killed it. But I do think there's an idea in the early web around anybody can publish, and those things can relatively easily be archived and preserved. So I think that plurality is still an important part of the conversation, especially when we talk about bringing AI tools in. So that's the Internet Archive. What are some of the challenges? Well, we have lots of stuff in lots of different formats. So one is just the size. One is the complexity of the formats themselves, which influence preservation and access decisions. How you provide access, to the web archive via the Wayback Machine is much different than how you access the television news archive. They're collected differently, they're maintained differently, they're indexed differently. How you can interact with them is, of course, very different. And that's true across everything. So software, books, audio, video. So that's a big challenge, because a research question, traditionally, due to these dependencies or just the boundedness of how formats are maintained and made accessible, means that research questions and scholarly work has been very bounded by a material type. So it could have been books, and then maybe it was articles, or maybe it's music or something like that. But I think increasingly in digital humanities and other works and other areas of scholarship, a question can now not really be bounded by a format. So if you're interested in criminal justice or something, there could be relevant material in many different types of collections, but providing a unified access mechanism to those is very hard. Providing a way to interpret very large amounts of data that you're going to get on a generic query across lots of different collection types is very hard. And then allowing people to sort of iterate with the data if you can get it, which you can, but it's a lot of work. Allowing a user or researcher to iterate on their research question through many different types of content at a very large scale is another challenge. So, and then of course there's infrastructure and funding challenges, which I think we all take for granted or know about, but are also, of course, good to evidence and discuss. So those are the challenges. How do we think AI can help solve some of these challenges, or what are some AI projects we could do? Some, I think AI is definitely proving more efficient in some operations that sort of existed a little before the AI explosion hype cycle thing. Machine learning approaches were happening before AI got very popular, but certainly things like automated cataloging and metadata generation, which Abby mentioned, as part of LC works are important. Things like speech to text, they sort of were around like maybe 5-8 years ago. But now it's very easy for all our audio video collections to just automatically get closed caption text transcripts as part of them. And we're collecting them often in their native AV form. So wrapping up, semantic knowledge graphs, just semantic tagging in general. And we've done a lot of work with languages, especially it turns out that the Web Archive has a lot of minor languages that don't have great representation in digitized print collections. And that's been a very useful tool for people who are preserving or building language models around very minor languages. So that's been interesting. So wrapping up, just the potential of AI to make things more discoverable just by traditional cataloging, metadata, findability type operations. The way that it can make things more queryable so that you can interact with a very large corpus of documents, records, images, AV, software, whatever it might be. And the way, I think, as we've seen in some of the Storm examples, that it can really help drive making things explicable and explainable and sort of fueling interpretive activities, not just the sort of summarization activities that we have normally seen. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we've seen a wide variety of presentations here. What is striking to me is the difference in scale that has come through. So are there any reflections on the difference in scale between, say, the first two presentations we've seen on historical documents and indigenous languages that are under threat, and the very wide-scale collections that we've heard in the... how might AI perform a role in dealing with such vast differences in scale, for example? Any thoughts on that?
I have in the experiments that we've been doing, we're learning a lot, and there's a lot of sort of data that are coming back, and so we're trying to share that what we're learning as broadly as possible, and in the previous transformations from, MARC to digitization to digital preservation, sort of what has really helped us was having shared practices and standards, quality standards, metadata standards, descriptive standards. That any scale can follow, and a lot of and I think there could be really interesting work on how to sort of thread together and sort of authenticate collections that have been curated or that we know are authentic, and have AI sort of help with that. There's standards that are out there. There's like the CTPA standard about content provenance, and I think collaborating on those kinds of things could really help make our content more usable for anything. There's models like the FADG, Digitalization Standards Group. They have extremely detailed technical standards on digital formats and what makes them preservable and not. That I think would be an excellent thing to develop for these different AI use cases, so that and to sort of have levels of access. When you're working with the most precious thing that doesn't exist, you sort of apply a sort of 5-star treatment to it. If you're working with something that exists 500 places, maybe apply the 1-star treatment to it. It doesn't cost as much. It's a little more approachable. But and then sort of organizing, organizing around different specialities. There's this group called AI for LAM, Library, Archives, and Museums. The Stanford University libraries are very active in it, and it's a group of librarians of all sizes, archives, museums, galleries who are using AI and sharing what they're learning, so that everyone can make progress together and everyone can sort of use this technology responsibly.
I think this generation of AI tools, where the large language models are the best example, they have a property that really helps people like me that are working with very, very, very small amount of data. And the property is that these models can really do transfer learning. And by that, I mean, they can be training large amounts of data and specialized into smaller. I'll give you an example. We are building translators for some of these languages. We take a translator that's typical for today, is trained with 500 million pairs of sentences. Then we take 5,000, 10,000 pairs of sentences in those languages, and we are able to create a useful translator for that language. This was just unthinkable, I don't know, 3 years ago. And similarly, we can do that. We take a model that was developed for another purpose, and with very little data, make it run reasonably well for language that have very, very small number of speakers. I think this is new, and this is a game changer for people who work with very specialized languages or knowledge or niche knowledges. And we are learning that. These models are very good in cheating, in pretending to learn. And we call it overfitting. The word is cheating. The real word is cheating. But as we develop the technology, we learn how to control that. But we still, every time that we do that, we take like this 5,000 languages from a dictionary, from a children book that was translated, things like that, and the model starts to generate a new language, this new language that never has been exposed before. It's really, really amazing. And that I think is transformative for many areas in terms of preservation, in terms of access, and so on.
The only thing I'll add is that because in the context of indigenous languages and cultures, there's a lot that many of us don't know, and we have the best of intentions, and we may not be able to imagine like what we can offer with these technologies. I find it helpful to think about designing and co-creating with the people who are in these the regions of the world, cultures of the world. I think with the perspectives that we have a certain bias, and we don't see their applications. They may imagine different sets of applications that we have never considered when we develop these sets of technologies. And of course, Claudio can tell better than I, but I think I want to emphasize this. As we are thinking about the research agenda and as we are thinking about inclusion and equity, it is important to design with the people. And they may come up with applications that we have never thought about, and we may be able to be creative and solve for those applications.
Thank you very much. Any further comments on this?
Can I? Oh, sorry.
No, go.
I just want to second what she said, but go one step further. One thing we found trying to do co-design with these communities is how much our design methods are cultural, how much our design methods do not work with them, and how we have to change that, and how hard it is to find this. So this is the moment that you cross cultures, and that's the difficulty here. So there's a whole area of research that has to be done in terms of how to design with other cultures, and I think that's really interesting for the design community as a future for them.
One of the topics that has perhaps been less addressed so far is that of indigenous data sovereignty. That means something very specific, and it seems to have the clarity of a certain term, but of course that means many different things in different contexts. And so the accessibility of data can mean very different things. So any reflections on that from any of the panelists?
I think that's super important, and I think it's a lesson that we keep relearning in each of these transformations that we go through. Is when we change, we digitize objects, we preserve objects, we sort of create descriptions for objects. It's there's a cultural element that is often misinterpreted, not captured correctly, and it is, and our practices don't reflect the community's practices. And I think there have been there's a lot of good lessons to learn on previous sort of mistakes and ways we did it wrong. And I think foregrounding the ethical practices, sort of that being part of the best practices that you have when you do this work, and particularly with Indigenous communities, letting them take the lead, letting them make the decisions, letting them be in control of their own data and their own culture, and that's things we've learned, before when we took data and did whatever we wanted with it, and that's not really appropriate. So I think our last the AI for Lamb group, they have a fantastic futures meeting every year, and the last one was in Canberra in Australia, and it was focused a lot on speech to text and large language models in Indigenous communities, and there, you can sort of see where it doesn't work in a couple of different levels. They talk about even the Australians speak to their Alexas in an American accent to get them to work, because they don't work with their Australian accents. And the place names, the Australian place names, are not unrecognizable with the large language models that they were using. But they're also the Maori community in New Zealand. They are building their own large language model in Maori, and it's developing a whole kind of licensing scheme that they're developing themselves, and it's really inspirational to see them do that. And they're building on audio archives. They have a radio station that they've been running for years, and so I think it's really inspiring to watch that. And I was really glad to be able to visit Australia and sort of hear from them directly what how they think about it and how they're approaching these things.
Thank you.
My view is that we have to make the preservation, the collection, the access of data from these communities safe for them. And right now it's not. And for that we have to change our own mindsets about it. First thing is we have to understand that the preservation of that culture, it's our interest to some level. And because it's our interest, we have to give something to them back. I think I'll just give two examples of how we could make this work safer for the communities. One is, for endangered indigenous languages, we should make them subject to copyright. You may say, well, you cannot make a language copyrighted. That's not correct. Constructed languages like Klingon are copyrighted. CBS owns the copyright of Klingon. You cannot write in Klingon if you want, without maybe receiving a nasty letter from CBS. And we should grant that same rights to endangered language so they can control who produces material, who accesses material, because right now it's very difficult for them, and because of that, they don't share that. They're including stories that they told researchers wrong ideas about their own language because they didn't trust people. So we have to make it safe. One is make them copyright. The community owns that copyright. That helps. Similarly, knowledge. If it's an old knowledge that a small community has, give that knowledge the same rights as patents, retroactively. This is to make the ground safe for them. So I'm sure they will be, in many cases, very willing to share with the worldwide system, or in those situations, they will be. But if they don't feel that they are in control, they will be very reluctant, because there is such a history of abuse, of exploitation, and so on. And those changes are not too hard to do. Those are examples. But again, we have to work with them. I agree totally. We have to understand. But we have to change our mindset and say, hey, this is so precious. We need to protect it. We do that for buildings. in historic buildings. It's the same thing. And let's do it in ways that make it safe, easy to enforce, where they can control this knowledge and that they developed for such a long time.
I would just add, and this is a conversation that comes from scholars in the Global South, researchers in the Global South, is that they are very, very, we talk about trust and, you know, in getting them involved. They're very, very jaded and very, very doubtful about the ways in which they are included in these sort of efforts. They are mindful that sometimes they are window dressing, so that you would bring on 1 or 2 people for the sake of a grant and that kind of thing, and bring them to an event, and but meaningful. Like, do they get an opportunity to meaningfully contribute? And there's a long history of that not happening, and those are conversations that happen all the time behind the scenes. You know, we say, well, I got invited to participate in event X, but nobody's listening to me, right? So that is something that we need to be really, and this is not a new conversation. This idea that we need to include people from the Global South and the community, we've been saying that from go. Yet here we are saying it again. So I just wanted to reiterate that this is there's something systematic here, a problem here that we need to be mindful of.
Thank you very much indeed. This is time to open the discussion to the floor. If you have any comment or question, please come up to the mic, or perhaps a mic can come to you.
Yes. Is it on? I don't think it's on. There are at least 2 people on our panel who are in institutions that are concerned with copyright. The Library of Congress is the copyright office for the United States of America, and the Internet Archive is an institution that is beleaguered with copyright issues. Now, I don't know how that, and the Internet Archive representative can talk about those, but I wonder, when you saw Chris Manning's cartoon of that machine that was absorbing billions of books and billions of web pages and billions of everything, or maybe trillions, what is the Library of Congress's attitude toward copyright for all of that? How is it going to play out?
Well, they've been releasing reports. The first report was around on different aspects of it. It's a big question. And right now at the Library of Congress, the current policy is that we cannot use generative AI to produce any public products. That is the policy. And there, because we are, I mean, there's many reasons for that policy, but there are exceptions, like the experiments that we do, and there are some exceptions, but a big barrier is the terms of service, the privacy issues with those systems, the security issues with those systems, the commercial systems is not compatible to federal rules. So those are, at least right now, and so these are, that's part of why we don't use it either. But the copyright issue, the Copyright Office has not said if this will be an infringement. You know, sort of what's already happened is infringing copyright. They might. I think it'll go to judges. So it's something that we're monitoring closely, and we don't use copyrighted material in our experiments generally. I mean, we have in a small amount in some ways, but we don't generally use copyrighted materials, which would drastically change the strategy if that's the actual policy of how we would use these technologies. But I think it would also open up other things. I think we have a lot of material that's not under copyright that we would like to encourage everyone to use and us to use. And I think and we've been investigating sort of, workflows, integrating, modernizing our tools. But I think we could use these tools in other ways, sort of like how we saw the poem this morning, the sort of how to delight users and engage users and things. And that may, looking at those kind of use cases and not focusing on, how do we use this to do the job that we've been doing forever? How do we use these tools to do things that we don't do, that we've never done, because we've never had the time or resources to do it. So I think even if I think we are ready to follow the policy whenever it comes out. But I think there's a lot of different ways to use the technology, and we don't have to use copyrighted materials necessarily to get a lot out of it, is sort of how we're approaching it right now.
Well, this is a fantastic question, and it's one that could derail the rest of the panel if we wanted to. So, yeah, Internet Archive's mission statement is universal access to all knowledge, and that knowledge can come in many forms and in many states. So there has been involvement in litigation around access to material of copyright indeterminate status, the orphan works kind of thing I mentioned. But there's also sort of the challenge of licensing in the modern era. Both scholarly literature, of course, is a huge one for many organizations, and publishers and things like that are prohibiting use of material in AI, or even for preservation or access, or even for distant reading, data mining type activities in a way that is contractually disputed by some, not necessarily by us. So I think it's not just a copyright issue, it's also a legislative issue. There was the court case just the other day of Thomson Reuters, right, which it was determined that whoever, OpenAI, I actually don't remember who, but some of the companies were scraping all their news media, and they've been claiming it's fair use. There's a million court cases going on this. The first judgment came down. Who knows what the future will hold? But they said it was not fair use. So I think the battle over scraping the web for the AI and the large language models is just getting started. So there's copyright. There's licensing. Can people do AI work on things that they have licensed in other forms if that license did not explicitly include use in AI projects, like Abby mentioned? And that is, there's also exemptions sort of for libraries and archives in many cases, which are allowed to collect and preserve material, and in many cases make it available in ways that a corporate or commercial entity couldn't. So there's lots of different vectors, and I think it's going to be a very challenging time to figure out how that's going to play out, especially with vested interest and corporate interest and who influences Congress, which traditionally has not been libraries, or just cultural or public sector organizations at all.
But I will say it's what we need too are people who are, we have to do things according to our policies, but it is fantastic that the Internet Archive can do things according to their policies,
Whatever they might be.
And that helps us all, it helps us sort of understand what we can do. And I think that's another benefit of collaborating and have different kinds of people doing, working on the same problem, because we can all do different things. We have different sort of leeways. We have different,
Yeah, it's really a challenge of the open commons, and it's not just like libraries or content holders. Wikimedia is very much involved in this battle, as many others are, and it's it's kind of easy to collect stuff and preserve it. That's generally not that hard, and there's exemptions for people that do that, or organizations and nonprofits and libraries. Access and use are just very challenging, and that can be computational access, it can be direct access to the thing, it can be mitigated access or sub-licensed access. So it's I think it's going to get very challenging, and it will be a group advocacy effort, especially.
He's got an unenviable position of being responsible for archiving an exponentially growing amount of space of stuff, but he doesn't have the money flows coming in that Google Corporation does, right? Like, it sort of seems like in the early days of Google, you know, Larry and Sergey were passionate for the common good and wanted to do things like, you know, collect up all the old Usenet news to preserve it and keep it available, but that's sort of fallen by the wayside now. So all the money's going to one place, but then the exponentially growing archiving need is going to the other place. And I know that Internet Archive did get some substantial finances to start off, but, you know, nevertheless, that seems like a not very viable position. But, you know, I think the same then continues at every other level, no matter what where you look, right? So if you want to get an Indigenous language incorporated into the translation programs of the major technology providers, well, you go and talk to them, and what they say is, well, if you could prepare some parallel data and make it available on an unencumbered license so we can use it for, you know, 0 cents, then probably we can do something for you, right? So again, all the costs are pushed down onto the Indigenous community or wherever they can get money from. And, you know, in general then for sort of development and archiving of Indigenous materials, well, there was a bit of discussion of Australia. I mean, in some sense, I think the Australian example is a little bit better than some, that it's sort of the government has put quite a bit of money into developing digital archives for Aboriginal materials. I think the situation is worse in the US, right? You know, sometimes it's fallen on, you know, there's some, like Berkeley has done a pretty good job at archiving Californian Indigenous language materials, but, you know, there's not a very good, well set up. So it sort of seems like they're the people that are left with a lot of work, and there's a different set of people that have the money. Are there any ways to sort of start to readdress this?
Yeah, that's great question number 2. Like, one is rights, second is funding. So, and yeah, we're a nonprofit funded by foundations, funded by donors, funded by some earned income services and things like that. But the challenge so far of AI has been that it's really expensive. It's expensive to do it yourself. It's expensive to buy the GPUs. It's expensive to use AWS to try to do, or whatever cloud service to try to do it for you. It just has a really high cost barrier to entry. And if you're in the sort of cultural heritage sector, this is a sector where budgets are declining, or at best static. So very hard to keep up with the increasing technological cost when your budget is stagnant. I think of one interesting model. I'm not saying it's the right one, but at least it's one that's emerging in a adjacent community, is the one which I referenced briefly before, around licensed journal content. So like I think the biggest portion of a university library's budget is paying publishers for access to their journals, for faculty to get access to the scholarship in their field. And that has been increasing 2 to 3x beyond inflation year over year, at the same time that university library budgets are generally static or going down. So this is not a long-term sustainable solution, that they continue to pay large publishers huge portions of their budget to this content that, at the end of the day, their faculty is already producing, right? So we'll ignore the absurdity of that part for the moment. But so there's tried to be a movement to have universities, affiliated sort of nonprofit players in the space, like Public Library of Science or other publishers that are non-commercial and public good oriented, to take over or to start dedicating a portion of their funding to support the development of the infrastructure, the tools, the systems, the services, staff, to start building a mirror publishing ecosystem that is supported, owned, operated by the universities or the nonprofits themselves. So it's, they're trying to put percentage numbers, like, it'll take us a long time to get out of these journal big deal subscription-y things, but as we go along, we're going to do 5% of our budget towards supporting open access publishing infrastructure, and then 10%, and then 15%, and try to do an economic model where funds that were going to commercial places and players and infrastructure providers, and it's the same in AI, right? Most people are paying OpenAI or ChatGPT or whoever if they're licensing an AI product. So I think there's preliminary discussions that the model around open access publishing and how to reallocate budgets towards supporting that ecosystem, a similar thing could happen, or hopefully in the AI infrastructure type space. So that's one idea. There, these are long scale, probably multi-decade type initiatives to try to steer the big ship of money towards something different. So who knows whether that will happen, but certainly as AI gets cheaper to run and smaller physical hardware footprint, it seems like it might be more possible.
Thank you. Leila?
I'll keep my answer brief. I know we have one more person standing. I just want to call out really in plain English that there's an extraction happening from the knowledge commons and the open spaces. And that extraction, as you say, Chris, cannot continue in this way. Like something needs to change. Jefferson was talking earlier, like we're at the start of a journey of change. What we have been kind of receiving as a response in terms of kind of payback to the knowledge commons from many for-profit organizations over the past years has been, well, we give you traffic. And that's like saying I give you a road and with some signs, right? Some signs may be bigger than some other signs. But the amount of profit that is coming from the knowledge commons for many of these organizations is significant, and this path is not sustainable, and it needs to change. So there should be more payback to the knowledge commons and open spaces and the public goods that we're talking about. So systemic changes are needed, of course, on those fronts, and I think all of us should work towards that.
Should we just go down?
If you have a comment on this before we get to the question.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, just one more. So I always think of prioritization. Like institutionally, we have to prioritize, and we have to, be smart about it. But thinking about the sort of shifting of like big priorities. I heard this story yesterday about the National Library of Norway. So they have digitized their rich state. They have lots of oil, but they're using their money like in their libraries, which is like they've digitized their entire collection, all of it. It's not huge, and they've also digitized Nigeria's collection. They've but I guess it started. Moriana is where one of their they have like preservation vaults in caves and stuff. But I guess that town used to be a mining town, and it was shut down, and the country decided to employ all those engineers in the library. And those people, built this incredible library system, digital library system. It was just kind of blew me away, that kind of prioritization and at the national level. And it's still, they're hiring 20 people right now in their library AI lab. They've just done that. And they're building their own Norwegian language model, at the library. It's an incredible investment that was inspiring.
It's great to have a positive story, even if it's so far away geographically. We have a question from the floor.
Yeah, I'm Wayne Yamamoto with the Common Craw Foundation, and we have a large archive that we make of the web that we make freely available. We're spending a lot of time to find, crawl, and categorize low resource languages. And my question is, on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is, this isn't any value or negative value, to 10, this is great. How does this rate for your specific work for AI and society in general?
Hard question. Everyone is thinking here. But in some ways, also answering the previous question, part of the problem we are facing is that when we cross this culture, we tend, in the West tend to look down on the other cultures, and we see what they have as less valuable. And that's sort of the difficulty of funding. And a great example is, I mean, suppose we all agree you have to save the Amazon, okay? Save the Amazon forest, okay? Not everyone agrees, but let's for a moment say, we are willing to pay some satellite company a fortune to get aerial data of the Amazon. But we are not willing to pay for the knowledge that the indigenous peoples have of how to manage that forest, which they have been doing for 10,000 years. For 10,000 years they managed. That's not a pristine natural forest. The Amazon forest is diverse because they made it diverse. They moved seeds. They create fertile soils. They know how to manage that stuff. And if it's not in good shape now, it's because 300 years ago, a bunch of foreigners came and spread disease to kill the people who knew how to manage and have been doing bad stuff for the last 200 years. But we are not willing to pay the same amount that we're willing to pay for the technology that was developed here for the technology that was developed there. And that's part of the problem here. And I think it's the same when I think, so what's the value of that technology? I look at an indigenous language, and sometimes they are so different. And I'm not a linguist, okay? I'm an amateur on that. But maybe they had solved how to talk about some mental disease, that the way they structure language would make depression accessible. But no, come on. Those guys, those primitive guys there solve that problem? That cannot be true. So a little of the problem is the arrogance that we have towards those technologies, in my view, and which we devalue in the end, which has to do with the global south thing that my colleague here was saying. So part of our issue is how we learn how much they know and how we are going to give them value back. Because I'm sure they know a lot of stuff that's very valuable to us. We are just being sort of too arrogant to accept and, of course, pay it back. It has to be sustainable. There's so much knowledge, so much stuff there that it has enormous value. It's just that it's hard for us to accept. It's an old colonial problem, and it's playing there, right?
We can take one more question before we go to back to the panelists and ask them to wrap up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I guess I'm just curious briefly if you are more concerned about like empowering scholars or just empowering the general public. And I guess if push comes to shove, would you rather make a curator's job like better and easier, or like a librarian's job better and easier, or your average user logging on? And obviously, like we'd get both, but that's just not the reality of like funding and prioritization. I guess where would you put the most impact in the next 3 to 5 years for AI?
That's a tough choice. It's a really tough choice because when we think about the Global South, for example, a lot of knowledge is held by communities that are not archived. And so by making that choice, we are choosing to not include perspectives. So I don't choose. I refuse to choose. I feel like we have to, and then the other side of it is we have to, assuming that if we're dealing with the Global South again, create spaces and ways to meaningfully incorporate, these archivists and record keepers and that kind of thing. So I refuse that choice.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know, somebody else might have a choice. No.
I mean, I will choose users. I'm not worried about, I'm always worried about making my job easier, but I think for us, like we have the biggest web archive, publicly accessible web archive in the world. And this is a record that is like one of the greatest historical records of the last 30 years is the web. Sure, there's garbage and crap on there, and sure, there's stuff that was also published and not on the web. So I'm not saying it's like the exclusive record, but it is an amazing historical resource in its diversity, its plurality, its complexity, its lots of formats, things like so. It's a very unique resource, but it is very hard to provide access to it. You go to the Wayback Machine, you put in your URL, and you see the old webpage. It's really, really challenging, technically, infrastructurally, economically, person time, to do new and interesting ways to be able to use that amazing collection. So that, I think, is, for us, like the greatest potential is how can we make the web archive more usable by anyone. It can be scholars, it can be the general public, it can be whoever shows up at the website. So I will choose the user.
Okay, that's a very clear response. Thank you very much. So as we wrap up, I'd like to ask each panelist to just focus on one particular thought, one take-home message from their particular combination of experience, project, and insight. So in 1 minute or less, please, could you give us some thought to take home with us? And we'll go down. Thank you.
The work we have been doing so far has been focused on this language that have like 5,000, 20,000 people range, where you can actually still hope to make that language go alive. That's not true for many languages. I mean, there are languages 522 people who speak. But I think this technology that we are developing of creating LLMs with very little data would allow us to do something very transformative in the way we preserve languages, which is to create an LLM which speaks that language to some level with very, very, very little data, to create an active, interactive archival of a language. It is a huge, interesting project, and we need, for that one, we need a really interested and generous funder.
Thank you very much. Audra?
I would just perhaps say a little bit differently something that I said earlier, and this gets back to the phrase that Monica used, which is the unknown unknowns, like getting our mind around the unknown unknowns. And so for me, the real concern here is, we're talking about worldwide knowledge, which is, everybody in here understands this. This is different from data. And knowledge is about interpretation, and interpretation, data can be interpreted from different perspectives depending on where you come from. And so how do we capture that sort of these multiple perspectives? Because there might be a tendency, or the concern I have is that when we go into worldwide knowledge, is almost the parallel in my head, which may not be fair, is that when we think of world history, there's a narrative around world history that still privileges the global north. So depending on who's teaching it. So when we think about worldwide knowledge, are we doing there's a danger of doing that.
Thank you very much. Abigail?
I'm still thinking about that last question. And the old Blue Ribbon Task Force document that Monica showed earlier, there's no preservation without access, there's no access without preservation. And I think I just think it's so important that institutions have a process to understand how to make decisions about these new technologies, and that is sort of built on what we've learned from others and what the mistakes we've done in the past, and so with that in mind, I sort of choose the institution but knowing that the institution has to be in collaboration with people here in this room. Our institution, we can prioritize making data as accessible as possible, making authentic data as accessible and usable as possible, and then people in this room can create the tools to use it and to transform it in new ways that matter to them, to their communities. So that's sort of closing thought.
Thank you. Leila?
I'll encourage us all to think about and keep in mind that in this space, nuanced thinking is what's going to take us a long way. So continue to think nuanced and invest in the open.
I'm inspired by the words of David Rosenthal, who was from Stanford and built digital preservation systems, and he said, the fundamental challenge of digital preservation is economic. And so riffing off of Chris's question and the comments about generous funders, the one way that you solve economic challenges is through collaboration. And we're all at this event to collaborate, be it, libraries, knowledge centers, open data people, scholars, technologists. So just giving a shout out that this is going to be a collaborative effort to try to solve economic problems.
I couldn't have come up with a more upbeat note on which to end. So let us thank all our speakers very much.